Okay, everybody. Our next speaker is going to be Bob Rosen. He's the CEO of Healthy Companies International. Really looking forward to this particular session today. Bob's a trusted. You'll see he's a trusted CEO advisor, an organizational psychologist, and a best-selling author as well. He founded the Healthy Companies 30 years ago with a singular goal of helping executives their leadership potential. So with support from a multi-year grant that he got from John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, Bob and his colleagues, they began an in-depth study of leadership. And since then, he's personally interviewed more than 500 CEOs in 55 different countries, become an advisor to many of these companies. And his book, Conscious, The Power of Awareness in Business and Life, was actually a Washington Post bestseller. We're lucky to have him today. Bob's going to be discussing leadership health, about grounded and conscious leaders at all levels. So without further ado, everybody, please join me in welcoming Bob Rosen. Bob, go ahead, take it away.
Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Today, we're going to talk about why grounded and conscious leaders are so critical to thrive through conscious change. What I'd like to say is that the material today is embedded in face-to-face instructor-led training and in a variety of self-paced digital learning for leaders at all levels. If we could take the first question, first slide. It's a really interesting time in the world today. The world is changing faster than our ability to adapt. And these changes are happening and presenting great challenges and ultimately great opportunities for all of us. If you go to the next slide, please. One of the things, and everybody's been talking about this today, is that we're all facing four primary burning priorities. One is the impact that COVID is having on our health and well-being. The second is the recognition that change, agility, and resilience, so learning to fall down and get up and make mistakes and be agile and adaptive, are becoming the critical competency and capability inside institutions. Suddenly, we've targeted diversity, inclusion, and equity, which is a really important issue, and we've seen it as a moral and a business opportunity. And then lastly is remote working. So where does that leave us? Well, genetically and psychologically, we are wired for survival and growth, but we also live in a deeply uncertain world, and the world is becoming increasingly bifurcated. Those who are adapting and growing and thriving in the face of uncertainty, where uncertainty is reality and stability is really an illusion. And those who are falling further and further behind. And with all this change, it's easier to see the high performers from the lower and mediocre performers. Next slide. So we do know a lot about how high-performance organizations place greater emphasis on a holistic approach to well-being. I remember a recent study that I4CP put out where they actually demonstrated that high-performance organizations, defined by revenue growth and profitability and market share and customer satisfaction, those companies were actually making a greater investment in a holistic approach to well-being, work engagement, total retention, productivity, and even creativity and innovation was much higher in these high-performance organizations. Next slide. So here's the challenge that we all face. We grew up in a world where what you do defines who you are. And what you do is very much based in a left brain hemisphere category where linear and analytic thinking were very, very important in our business models. But recently, we've turned that paradigm upside down. And we now are seeing that who you are as a human being drives what you do, and that competencies are critical, but they may not be enough. And this is really where who you are as a human being really comes into play. Next slide. Now, how does this actually transfer into a leadership approach? Well, first off is that we've spent so much time in the blue bucket, creating capabilities and skills and linking them to KPIs and performance outcomes. And what I'd like to suggest today is that we have missed the leading indicator in all of this, which is who you are. And we're going to talk about grounded and conscious. Next slide. Grounded is the foundation, which helps leaders stay centered and rooted and resilient in the face of disruptive change. Now, grounded leadership is defined in 6 ways. Next slide. First off is that our physical health is all about being agile and nimble in uncertain times. Our emotional health is about being tough and nimble in uncertain times. Physical health is about being agile in a fast-paced world. Intellectual health is being relevant in a complex environment. Social health is about being authentic and deeply committed to both people and digital machines. Our vocational health is all about being competitive in a demanding world. And our spiritual health actually is about being connected to a bigger universe. These are the 6 roots of being grounded. And if you go deeper into these roots, next slide, you begin to see that there are critical personal leadership and human capabilities for each of these 6 areas of health. And who you are drives what you do. I'll give you a couple examples. Next slide. The slide before, go back, please. I met Nando Parado at a speech that I was giving. And in fact, he stood up. I was having lunch with him, and he walked up to the microphone, and he gave an incredible speech about how he and his rugby mates were flying over the Andes, and the plane went down. I think they were at 74 or 10,000 feet. And it was very, very cold, and they had to live there for 74 days. His mother and sister died, among many of his teammates. And eventually he walked down the mountain. Now, you all know the story of Alive. But what Nando teaches us is that, and he basically expresses this, is that I learned to be a grounded and conscious person as a result of that crisis in my life. Now, we all don't have to go down a mountain and be frozen for 74 days to get this. And he would be the first to admit it. But he basically says it's critical to stay self-aware, committed to your own development, and really exhibit positive emotions as resilience as much as possible. We've interviewed CEOs around the world that represent each of these healths. Next slide. One other thing I want to say about that last slide, and that is it is a holistic, integrated approach to leadership, much like our cardiovascular and respiratory systems work together in an integrated whole. So do all of these. People don't show up in physical health or intellectual health or vocational health. They show up as holistic people, and we need to help them improve those. Now, not everybody's great in all of them, and everybody has strengths and shortcomings, and perfection is not the goal. However, it's important that we make a commitment to all 6, because taking care of yourself is the most important job of being a leader. Next slide. Data shows that all 6 predict leadership performance as rated by bosses, peers, and subordinates. But if you see spiritual health, as we define as, do you have a higher purpose? Are you globally connected to the world, which is really at the heart of understanding and embracing diversity and inclusion? And do you have a generosity of spirit? That is the most predictive, believe it or not, of high-performing leaders. Next slide. Now, conscious is the accelerator that results in leaders being highly adaptive and aware to lead through change. Now, a couple things here. One is that most of us were challenged to be the smartest kid in the room, and that took us into our jobs. But conscious is, but smart is important, and it's really based on the left side of the brain. But conscious has taken over, where conscious is the new spark. And we define conscious as awareness and action. Are you aware of yourself? Are you aware of others? And are you aware of your surroundings? Next slide. So we did a study with Harris, and we asked several thousand people and leaders inside companies, how conscious are you? And as you can see, most people believe that they are conscious. But when you ask people how conscious the people who lead them are, next click, you begin to see that only 60% of employees rate their executives as conscious. And so conscious is in the eyes of the beholder. And we need to help leaders become more self-aware. And we're doing some things, but we're really just cutting the surface here in terms of helping people become conscious. So let me tell you a little bit about conscious. Next slide. Reid Hastings is an interesting fellow. He had a vision in 1997 when he started Netflix to become a media powerhouse combining entertainment, technology, and consumerism. But what you might not know is as his business model changed, he had to transform himself, learning to apologize in public and had to admit mistakes. He prematurely wanted to get rid of discs and go to the internet. He had to put his values in practice and developed a whole values-based competency set that many other companies are using today. He's a conscious leader that is succeeding. Now, let me give you an example of another set of leaders. Wells Fargo today, actually in 2016, Wells Fargo was one of the most respected, admired brands in this country. And I hope I'm not offending anybody who works at Wells Fargo on this call. But there was a shift. And today, Wells Fargo is probably the most reputationally challenged of all the banks in this country. Now, what happened? Well, what happened was there was pressure inside the organizations for all their employees to be selling products to their customers. And it created a very toxic, competitive environment inside of Wells Fargo. And it changed its culture. And the top leaders ignored or they facilitated this happening. And at the end, Wells Fargo lost billions of dollars in litigation losses. The stock has eroded along with its growth. They've lost customers and there's a damage to their brand and reputation. So let's peel the onion back on conscious and see how we're doing here. Next slide. So there are 4 pitfalls that prevent conscious leadership. The first one is people are too stagnant in their progress. They're too protective and reactive. They're afraid of the uncertainty of change. They stay shackled in old assumptions and faulty facts, and they fail to evolve and transform. A second group of people are too shallow in their self-knowledge. They're unaware and too superficial in their thinking and feeling. They spend little time self-reflecting and they stay stuck in their own personal stories about change. And their ability to lead change and to build relationships in this complex changing world is often stunted. There are other people who are too small. They're biased and closed-minded. They're living in a steel bunker of thinking where they have biased minds and perspectives are outdated. They miss opportunities, they alienate others, and they react irrationally to the changes in front of us. And then we have people who are too safe. They're too cautious and isolated. They lack a sense of urgency or accountability, and they're overwhelmed by anxiety, or they ignore anxiety altogether and they live in a world of complacency. They fail to see connections and possibilities and mutual solutions, and it really undermines their ability to inspire true extraordinary work. These are the 4 pitfalls that we see in our research. Our research has actually been going on for about 30 years, looking at leaders and particularly change leaders at all levels and what's getting in their way and what will continue to get in their way as they move forward. So what's the solution? Well, what we've also found is that there are great conscious leaders who practice 4 areas. First is that they get real. They must see reality for what it is and not what we want it to be. They go deep inside themselves and they truly build a deep awareness of how they show up in the world and how they manage their personal and business lives. They think big in a world of possibility and they expand the change. And ultimately, they have to step up and become change leaders and energize the change in others. So let's dig a little deeper into the practices of conscious. Get real. One of the things that is required in Get Real is we have to change our relationship to change. We have to move from seeing change happening to us to seeing change happening for us. We also have to face the facts and distinguish great facts from faulty assumptions. And then thirdly, we have to become much more comfortable being uncomfortable. But we've never been taught how to do that. So this is about getting real. Next slide. Going deep is about, first off, managing your threat response. Your threat response occurs in your reptilian brain, which impacts your physical body, and your amygdala in the emotional brain. And we get increasingly hijacked in our emotional brain when change happens very quickly. And so we have to learn how to sort of rely on our bodies and understand how we react to threats. Secondly, is we got to leverage our positive emotions. We're wired for negative and positive emotions. And the negative ones we have to experience because it's part of life, like anxiety and sadness and anger and shame. But we want to spend as much time in our positive emotions, like hope and compassion and forgiveness and optimism and confidence and, yes, love. And then lastly is that we've got to identify our thinking errors. Now, our thinking errors are like magnifying problems that really don't exist. It's about making big assumptions that are faulty. It's about personalizing problems when they occur. And there are a variety of thinking errors that exist in our executive brain, which is the most advanced part of our brain. And we have to become more aware of those. The third area is to think big. Now, first off, is that we have to get up on the drone. We have to see over the horizon and imagine things. In fact, imagination and possibility thinking is probably more important than ever in the new normal. We also have to develop a Google mind. The Google mind is relevant and it's always changing, just like the way we use Google today. We can go anywhere, we can learn fast, and learning agility becomes probably the most important skill in the new reality. And then lastly is we have to leverage our personal ecosystem. Now, one of the dilemmas is that in moving from hierarchy to connective networks is that our personal ecosystems become more important than ever to fulfill our deep need for belonging and connection. So how are you articulating your brand in your personal ecosystem? Are you building win-win relationships and learning from them and using those networks to greater possibilities? And also, are you building great relationships, healthier relationships? So our personal ecosystem becomes very, very important. The next one is to step up. And this is the fourth practice. And it starts with the ability to live with just enough anxiety. Not too little, which is the face of complacency, and not too much, which is the face of chaos, but it's just enough anxiety. And that ultimately leads us to leading with constructive impatience, because we need to create just enough anxiety in the people that we manage, not too much and not too little. And these are two leaders, one, Angela Merkel, who started in too little anxiety, and she's been growing to become a just enough anxiety leader. Jeff Bezos, the opposite. He started with probably too much anxiety, and he basically has moved into the just enough anxiety, and he's changing the employee practices inside of Amazon. And then lastly is to build a shared consciousness. And in a shared consciousness here, people have to be aligned. And we have to align people with their hearts and minds. This is just a picture of the Washington Nationals, where they engage the community and the teammates and like in a whole shift in attitudes about baseball in Washington, D.C., where I live. Next slide. So this is just a summary, moving from shallow to go deep, moving from being narrow to thinking big, moving from being safe to getting real, and moving from being small to stepping up. This shift has to occur in every single employee in the new normal. Next slide. Now, when we look at conscious, and we've done 360 assessments for thousands of people, and what we find is that leaders who are conscious, and we split the groups up into high self-awareness and low self-awareness, and we looked at the percent of leaders scoring high on leadership performance as rated by bosses, peers, and subordinates. And what we found is the self-aware people, not rocket science, perform much better than people who are low in self-awareness. Next slide. So how do we actually change people? Because this is really hard. One of the big challenges is that we have not been able to engage in sustainable behavior change. So the first thing is we come to work in 4 channels of learning. The seen channel, which is our perceptions, and that can be clear or distorted. Our thinking challenge, which is our beliefs, and our beliefs can be open or closed. Our emotions, our feeling channel, which is all about, are we exhibiting and experiencing positive versus negative emotions, and how we act. Are we productive or unproductive, which is really our behaviors. Now, we see in our work that people are naturally seers, thinkers, actors, and feelers, and they have a whole different combination. But you have to have all 4 channels operating to sustain change. You can see your way into new ways of acting, or act your way into new ways of seeing. You can think your way into acting, or you can feel your way into seeing things differently. So we have to practice all 4 of them. And I don't think that our learning programs have really drilled down on each of these 4 modalities to actually create sustainable behavior change. Next slide. Another thing that we have to do is we have to leverage our accelerators. This is a picture of the Dabawala network in India. They deliver millions of hot lunches every day, and they are so proud of what they do. And they use their internal accelerators to drive their work. Next slide. So here's a list of accelerators. And we need to help people see which accelerators they've developed over the world, over their lifetime, and then help them to access them during times of intense change. Next slide. Michael Phelps is the greatest swimmer in the world, but in 2010, his world fell apart after Beijing. Alcohol and drug use, mismanaged relationships, suspension of his car, things like that. Eventually went into an inpatient facility, and he discovered himself in the process. And he identified his own hijackers, like perfectionism and obsession with success and the like. Next slide. So you begin to see that we each have hijackers that stand in our way. And we all know them generally, but the question is, what do we do about them? And this is where engaging people in grounded and conscious conversations is so critical. Next slide. So what do you do about all this? Well, we believe that we have to make a commitment to build grounded and conscious workforces. It starts with our leaders' health and well-being. Ultimately, they show up in teams as very different people as they build agile and resilient teams. And these collaborative high-performance teams ultimately operate best when they are surrounded in an organizational health and well-being culture. And it acts as a circular virtual process. Next slide. So let me give you an example. We've been partnering with Cigna over the last year and a half to develop a grounded and conscious workforce, but particularly the top 8,000 leaders in their organization. And we've done work at the top with the 550 leaders, sharing grounded and conscious capabilities, having them work with them, creating a toolkit. And then in the middle of the organization is certifying their leaders to actually go and teach this stuff. And finally, at the bottom, it's really digital engagement. This is a common model that companies are using, but the technology is so critical here. Next slide. So one of the things that Cigna and Healthy Companies did was we created a robust digital learning experience. And this is being offered in face-to-face learning. It's being offered in virtual leadership training, and it's being offered as self-paced experiences. One of the speakers earlier talked about moving from seeing leadership development as an event and seeing it as an experience. We completely agree with that. It's got to be sticky. It's got to be sustainable. It's got to be interactive. It's got to tap into the culture and the business priorities of the organization. So this is just a couple slides around this grounded and conscious leadership experience. And the next slide. And finally, you can put all of this into an interactive digital experience so people can learn about accelerators and hijackers. They can talk about this with other people and the like. One of the things I do want to mention that a lot of additional resources, next slide, a lot of additional resources are in our booth. So we have a lot of the content supporting this in our booth, and I look forward to some questions, and I really appreciate, one of the great gifts of a speaker is your attention, and so thank you for that.
Well, yeah, no, thank you, Bob. That was some fantastic information, and wanted to start out with a question right out of the gate. We've all seen and heard a ton of suggestions about this, role-playing exercises and classroom sessions on this. So I wanted to ask you again, how do you handle somebody on the team that insists on being negative and really doesn't want to lean into positive emotions? How do you suggest that that is handled?
Well, one of the things that we've found is that people are more hungry to talk about this stuff than we ever imagined. They want human connection. And I think that's one of the outgrowths of the future here beyond COVID and remote learning is that people really want this. Your question is a tough one because generally people who are negative are stuck in those negative emotions that I talked about, or stuck in old stories about themselves, and they come to situations with claws, and they're hyper-reactive, and they jump on situations and the like. I believe that peer pressure is probably the best way of dealing with that. You certainly don't want to call out a person like that in a meeting, except for saying, look, let's get back on track, and good facilitators know how to do this. But I do think that if you involve peers in those conversations, they will self-manage that person. And that's been my experience if you empower teams to talk and be courageous in their conversations.
All right, and in regards to your, you went in depth with the 4 pitfalls there, and one of them in particular, the too safe pitfall. That seems like, in today's world where the sensitivity is really high for a lot of people in a lot of different forums with social media and all this kind of stuff. Can you quickly discuss that again? How do you really overcome that particular pitfall in today's day and age?
Well, we're never taught to live in uncertainty. It's not been part of children's education. It's typically not part of, and many of us sort of cling to stability, and the body and the mind naturally go there. But the outside world is constantly changing. Every time we breathe into uncertainty. And so, as I said, uncertainty is reality. So we need to teach people how to thrive in uncertainty. And what does that mean? First off is we got to get people comfortable at looking deeply at themselves, their strengths and their shortcomings. Secondly, we have to teach them how to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is an asset. And we have to give people permission to be vulnerable with their peers. Third is we've got to teach them how to become comfortable being uncomfortable. And there are techniques and lessons and activities and to actually help people do that. Too safe is a real problem in large corporations because the middle of the organizations oftentimes are in the dark about where the company is going, unless the CEO and the top management are very, very vocal in terms of town meetings and the like. And I think the best companies do this, and they really empower people. But a lot of people feel like they're operating in the dark. And the more knowledge that they have, the more safe they'll feel. Your microphone is off. Bobby, your microphone's there. You go.
It's going now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Apologies. Yeah, this is the new world we live in. Thanks for letting me know about that. I just sat there talking to myself for a couple of minutes. So I'm not sure if you can do this or not, but maybe like almost a case study. Can you give some examples? Maybe you don't have to name drop it. Can you give some examples of organizations that you've worked with that have rolled out some of these steps that you've been highlighting for us?
Well, IBM Canada is an organization where they've integrated grounded and conscious into business strategy meetings. And they've found with their partners and then with people who work for their partners. And that has been a very useful kind of thing. We did some work with the top CEOs at PwC in all of their country territories, in the top 21 territories. And they embraced the grounded model. And ultimately, I mean, some of this stuff is starting in wellness, and it's moving up into a more business strategic perspective about, I mean, last slide said 90% of CEOs say that they have to change skills. We got to start with who we are as human beings.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think we have time for one more question, and then I'll of course remind everybody that that this will be available after the event for several days, and they can of course contact you guys individually. But kind of a two-part question: are companies leveraging all of this and aligning these competencies in performance management to measure behavior change, and how else can a company measure outcomes and impact?
Well, it's a great question. As we recognize that more skills on the right side of our brain are important, like empathy, like perspective taking, like true relationship building, like connection, like self-management and introspection, it's going to be harder and harder to measure that, but we have to. One of the things that's critical is we have to connect this to the business strategy. And one of the things that Cigna did was they changed their business model. They have competencies and they have great competencies, but they put grounded and conscious in the middle of their leadership development strategy, where who you are drives what you do, the competencies that links to the KPIs. I also think that we've got to build virtual environments that really engage managers in people's development, and also develop much more peer-to-peer learning, so people are getting feedback about what they're doing.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much for all of that, going over some really sensitive topics there. We like the insight into kind of the new values and the mindsets and behaviors that are necessary to prevent, and promote, health and well-being, changing the agility, like how you talked about the resilience and diversity, inclusion, and equity in a digital environment, all huge topics right now and going forward. So I want to take this opportunity on behalf of everybody in the audience, including us here at Opal Group. Thanks so much for joining us today, Bob.
My pleasure.